The morning Gerald's lawyer slid the final papers across the table, Ruth Holt pressed the pen to the first signature line and wrote her name in a hand that did not shake. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She had decided this the night before, in a motel room on Route 9 with the curtains pulled and the television off and nothing around her but the low hum of the heating unit and the sound of Pearl turning circles on the other pillow. She would not let her hands shake in that office. She kept that promise to herself. Gerald sat across the table with his attorney and a financial advisor she had never met, a man with a pressed collar and a yellow legal pad. And for the full 2 hours of signing, Gerald did not look at her once. The house went to him. The retirement accounts were divided in a calculation her own lawyer had called equitable, and she had known from the first reading was not. But proving the difference would have cost more than she had left. The hardware store, which Ruth had managed the books for without a paycheck for 11 of their 45 years together, had been assessed at a number she recognized as fiction. She signed anyway, 7 times. Each signature felt less like a decision and more like a door she was finding closed when she arrived at it. She walked out on a Tuesday morning in October with $4,800 in a checking account Gerald had apparently missed during the asset review, a storage unit key on an orange plastic fob, and Pearl in a carrier on the passenger seat of the 2009 Honda with the cracked dashboard she'd been meaning to replace since the spring. The storage unit was on the west side of town, a 10-by-10 concrete room that smelled of cardboard and cold air. Nora had arranged the packing, and it showed. Ruth's teaching materials from the 12 years she'd spent in a third-grade classroom before she left for the hardware store occupied 3 boxes, stacked without any sense of what they held. Her kitchen things were wrapped without tissue paper. The mixing bowls her grandmother had used in a farmhouse kitchen 40 years before Ruth was born, the cast-iron skillet she had seasoned every few months since before Paul could walk, a set of blue-rimmed plates that had survived 2 moves and 1 bad flood. Her winter coats were stuffed into a contractor bag. 2 boxes held photographs that had not been sorted or arranged, just swept from the shelves of the spare bedroom and closed. Against the back wall, stacked separately from the rest, were 4 boxes from her mother's house. Ruth had brought them home 11 years ago when Estelle died and had stored them in the attic above the garage, and Gerald had apparently included them in whatever accounting governed his version of her fair share. She was surprised he had kept them at all. Nora must have packed them without checking, treating them as Ruth's things the way she had treated everything in that attic as Ruth's things, which was the only accurate assumption her daughter had made in 18 months. Ruth loaded the Honda 1 box at a time. Pearl watched from the carrier on the front seat, tail moving in a slow arc, unimpressed with all of it. She drove to a diner 3 blocks from the storage facility and ordered coffee and eggs and ate at the counter because every booth was taken. The woman behind the counter was close to Ruth's age, with the particular efficiency of someone who had been doing this work long enough that the movements were unconscious. She refilled Ruth's cup without being asked and did not try to make conversation, and Ruth was grateful for both things. She spent the night in the same motel on Route 9 where she had been staying for 6 weeks. The rate was $47, which she had already calculated into the $4,800 the way she had once calculated the hardware store's weekly receivables. She had been good with numbers. Gerald had mentioned this at dinner parties sometimes, in the tone of someone presenting a feature of a well-chosen possession. He had chosen her when she was 22 and teaching 3rd grade at Clement Elementary, and he was 31 and running a hardware store his father had built and was beginning to run quietly into the ground. She had loved him the way you love someone when you are young and believe that love is enough to structure a life around. She had not been wrong that what she felt was real. She had been wrong that it was sufficient. The classroom was the first thing she left behind. In their 4th year of marriage, Gerald's store hit a sustained bad stretch, and he needed someone who understood where the loss was coming from. Ruth had a gift for the order of numbers, for the place where a ledger disagreed with itself, and she took unpaid leave from the school, intending to go back the following fall. She never went back. The store stabilized and then grew, and Gerald told her she was more valuable there than in any classroom, and she believed him because she wanted what they were building to hold, and because the children came, Paul in their 5th year and Nora in the 8th, and because the years move the way years do when you are raising children and keeping books and cooking dinner and the speed of them doesn't reveal itself until something stops. Paul lived in Denver now. He had called once after the separation papers were filed, said he was sorry, and Ruth had not heard from him since. She had stopped counting the months. Nora had called her the week before the final filing to say she thought Ruth should be practical about this, which was the sentence Nora had been trained to say, and Ruth had known it the moment she heard it. The end had not come suddenly. Gerald had been different for 2 years before Ruth said anything out loud, quieter at meals, present in the house in a way that felt like absence. She noticed and did not speak, in the way that people who have built something large and fragile notice cracks and choose not to look at them directly for fear of what looking will require. When she finally looked directly, she found what she already knew. A woman named Carol who worked at the county planning office and had known Gerald through the business for several years. Gerald did not ask for forgiveness. He presented his terms through his lawyer within 10 days of telling her. She spent 6 weeks in the motel on Route 9 while the paperwork moved. She tried to hold the shape of a plan, something forward-facing, something that didn't require her to calculate too precisely what 45 years had added up to. She had the Honda and the cat and the storage unit and $4,800. She did not know what came after that. On the third night after the papers were signed, she opened her mother's boxes. She did it without ceremony, sitting cross-legged on the motel carpet with the boxes in a row in front of her and Pearl stretched on the bed behind her. Most of what was inside was expected. Estelle's good china wrapped in newspaper, 2 quilts in plastic bags, a collection of Reader's Digest from the 1980s that her mother had believed in the way some people believe in vitamins. Old birthday cards. A wooden box of costume jewelry. Earrings without mates. A cameo brooch Ruth remembered on Estelle's coat collar every winter Sunday. A string of pearls she had worn once for the photograph taken at Ruth's wedding. In the second box, beneath a stack of church bulletins and a photo album Ruth set aside to look at later when she could manage it, there was a manila envelope. Old, its edges soft with handling, its flaps sealed with brown tape that had dried and re-adhered at an angle. On the front, in her mother's handwriting, her full name, Ruth Garrett Holt. Not Ruth Holt. Ruth Garrett Holt, the way Estelle had always written it when she wanted something to land with full weight. Ruth held the envelope without opening it for a long moment. Pearl made a sound from the bed, one low note of inquiry, and Ruth opened it. Inside were 2 things. A sheet of paper covered in her mother's handwriting, written on the back of what appeared to be a grocery list, and a folded document with a county seal pressed into the upper left corner. She read the letter first. Ruthie, I've kept this too long. I sealed the barn in the spring of 1972 because what was in there was more than I could face after your father died. I thought someday I would go back and couldn't, and then time made going back feel like something that would never happen. I'm giving this to you now because you are the only one who deserves what's in there, and because I think a day will come when you need it. Don't bring Gerald. The key is in the Hatbox, in the lining, at the bottom left corner. Mama, the grocery list on the other side said milk, bread, dishwashing soap, coffee. Ruth turned to the folded document. It was a property deed, recorded in Harper County in 1958, naming Estelle May Garrett as sole owner of 11 acres of land on Briar Creek Road. The land had a structure listed, 1 dwelling, 1 outbuilding. At the bottom, in ink faded to the color of old tea, someone had written by hand, transferred to Ruth Adele Garrett Holt upon Estelle's death, her handwritten codicil dated June 1994. Ruth sat on the motel carpet with the deed in her hands, and Pearl watching from the bed, and the heating unit humming, and the parking lot light coming through the gap in the curtains, and she was very still for a long time. She had not known this property existed. Estelle had not mentioned it once in 69 years. Harper County was 3 hours north, up into the ridge country, a part of the state Ruth had driven through once on a trip she and Gerald had taken before Paul was born, and she had no memory of her mother speaking of anyone in that county, of any land, of any barn. She had known Estelle for nearly 7 decades and had believed she understood the shape of her mother's life. And here was an envelope at the bottom of a box that said otherwise. Don't bring Gerald. She reached into the third box and found the Hatbox near the bottom, an octagonal box covered in faded blue fabric. Inside was a straw hat with a pink ribbon, wrapped in tissue. Ruth turned the box upside down and pressed her fingers along the silk lining at the bottom. She found the shape in the lower left corner the way you find something in a dark room that you already knew the location of. A small, hard, oblong shape beneath the fabric. She worked the lining loose with her thumbnail until it gave, and the key dropped into her palm. It was longer and heavier than she expected. Old brass, the kind used in a padlock, dull with age but solid. The ring at the top was thick. She turned it over in her palm and felt the weight of it, which was not only the weight of metal. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark with pearl draped across her legs and thought about a barn sealed in 1972 and a note on the back of a grocery list and a key that had survived 52 years in a hat lining and 11 years in an attic and 6 weeks in a storage unit and 1 night in a motel room on Route 9. She thought about Gerald not looking at her across the table. She thought about Nora saying she should be practical. She thought about an 11-acre property in Harper County with her name on the deed and a building that had been closed since the spring of 1972 and a mother who had written, clearly and without explanation, "Don't bring Gerald." Her mother had known. Not specifically, perhaps, not the name Carol or the county planning office, but Estelle had known something about Gerald that Ruth had spent 45 years choosing not to look at, and she had written it into a letter she sealed and stored in a box she knew would only be opened when the pretending was over. By 5 in the morning, Ruth had made her decision. She packed the car before the sun was fully up. She loaded Pearl and Pearl's food in the litter box she'd kept in the motel bathroom. She put all 4 of her mother's boxes in the trunk because she was not leaving them in a storage unit that cost $40 a month to access. She put both winter coats in the back seat. She slid the brass key into the outer pocket of her handbag where she could feel it. She stopped at the gas station 2 miles from the motel and filled the tank, $44 and change, and bought a paper map of Harper County because her phone's GPS had dropped signal twice in the Ridge Country during the one trip she remembered, and she did not want to be 3 hours from anywhere with a dead battery and a cat and a deed to property she had never seen. She drove north through the kind of morning that comes in October in that part of the state. The sky pale gray and the light still thin, the interstate moving through familiar country that she watched without much feeling. The towns she knew by name. The exits she had taken for various purposes over various years. Pearl slept with one paw through the carrier mesh, her chin resting on the wire. The second hour was different. The land began to lift. The road curved in longer sweeps, following the contours of creek valleys below the embankment, and the trees thickened along the ridgelines. Hardwoods mixed with pine, their leaves at the full turn now, yellow and rust, and a brown that was almost orange in the places where the morning light reached through. Ruth drove and watched the country change and felt the attention you pay when you are heading somewhere unfamiliar towards something you do not entirely understand. She took the exit for Harper County at 10:47. The state route narrowed to 2 lanes, and the signage thinned to small green rectangles on wooden posts at junctions. Some of them faded past reading. She followed the route she had traced on the map the night before. 3 lefts, a right, and then 6 miles on a gravel road that appeared on the atlas as a thin gray line, and appeared in reality as 2 compressed strips of earth with grass growing in the center, the kind that told her someone had driven it regularly once and then stopped, and the land had begun its slow reclamation. The gravel road ran between fields that had gone to seed, old fence posts with sagging barbed wire, second-growth woods taking back the margins of what had once been cleared ground. A rusted hay rake sat at the edge of one field with one wheel missing and its tines pointed toward the sky. No houses visible. No other tire marks in the gravel beyond her own. At the 5-mile mark, she saw the mailbox. Steel, faded to the color of old pewter, the name on the side painted over long ago and never repainted. But beneath the paint, in letters that emerged when she stopped the car and looked with the flat morning light at the right angle, it said Garrett. Ruth sat with the engine idling and looked at her mother's name on a mailbox at the end of a gravel road in a county she had visited once in her life. Then she turned left up the track behind it. It was barely a track, 2 ruts in the grass with a strip of growth between them, the kind that meant someone had driven it with some regularity and then stopped decades ago. The Honda moved slowly through 2 curves, its undercarriage dragging once where the ground rose sharply, and then the track straightened and the property opened ahead of her. She had expected ruin. The property had been untouched since 1972 by her mother's account, and 52 years of untouched land in a wet climate produced a specific kind of gone. She had been calculating this on the drive, running rough numbers against what she had left, the cost of clearing, the cost of making a structure habitable, if a structure remained at all, whether $4,800 was a beginning or just a way to measure how far she was from one. What she found was not what she had calculated. The farmhouse was gone. Not collapsed, not standing half-fallen on itself, but gone, its absence marked by a rectangle of cut stone at the near edge of the clearing, a foundation filled with decades of leaves and small volunteer trees that had taken root in the shelter of the walls. Whatever had stood there had come down some years ago, by weather or by someone's decision, and the land had accepted the vacancy the way land does. But the barn was standing. It sat at the far end of the clearing, back from the old foundation by 60 feet or more, and it was larger than she had expected, 40 feet across at least, with vertical board and batten siding that had weathered to a gray, so even and old it looked less like wood and more like something the land had grown there itself. The roof dipped along one section of the ridge, a visible sag she could see from where she had stopped the car. But it held. The boards were tight, no visible gaps in the siding, no places where the structure had buckled or spread. The whole thing canted perhaps 2 degrees off plumb, eastward, a lean so slight and gradual it might have been intentional. There was a door at the near end, wide enough to have once taken farm equipment. It was closed, and even from the distance between her car and the barn, she could see the padlock through the hasp, the same old brass color as the key in her bag, and the hasp was wrapped in wire that had rusted to red-brown and been wound there tightly by someone who had wanted the closing to be permanent. Ruth turned off the engine. The clearing went quiet around her. The wind in the tall grass along the margins, a crow calling from the tree lean to the north, Pearl shifting in the carrier and pushing her nose to the mesh to read the air. Ruth sat for a moment and looked at the barn. She thought about Estelle packing a key into the lining of a hat in 1972. She thought about her mother choosing to write the note on the back of a grocery list, as if the two things belonged together. The ordinary business of keeping a household and the extraordinary business of keeping a secret. She thought about the deed with her name written at the bottom in faded ink, a document that had existed for 30 years before Ruth ever held it. She got out of the car. The cold came at her immediately, the ridge country kind, not the flat cold of the valley below, but something with an edge to it, moving. She pulled her coat collar up and walked across the clearing toward the barn. The tall grass caught at her ankles, and her shoes collected burrs from something growing at knee-height along the path. The ground was uneven beneath the grass, old furrows maybe, or the memory of a path that had grown over. She walked without hurrying. She reached the barn door and put her hand against the siding. The wood was cold and solid under her palm. She could smell the age of it, a dry mineral smell underneath the outdoor cold, the specific smell of wood that has been standing in one place for a very long time. The wire around the hasp was stiff with rust. She worked the loose end with her fingers, pressing and turning, until the coil began to give. She unwound it slowly, careful not to let the wire spring, and when it was off, she held the padlock in both hands. It was heavier than the key. The brass had gone green in the seams where moisture had worked its way in over the decades, and the shackle was set tight in the body, but the mechanism itself looked intact. She reached into her bag and found the key. She put it in the lock. It fit the way a key fits a lock it was cut for, without resistance, seating cleanly. Ruth held it there without turning it. Behind her, the clearing was still except for the wind. Pearl made one sound from the car, a single questioning note that carried in the cold air. Ruth stood before the door of her mother's sealed barn with the key in the lock and thought about what Estelle had written on the back of a grocery list 52 years ago. What was in it was more than I could face after your father died. She thought about what 45 years of a particular kind of marriage prepares a woman to face and what it does not. She thought about a motel room on Route 9 and 7 signatures and $4,800 and a cat watching from a carrier's seat. She thought about the fact that her mother had kept this key for 30 years after writing that letter and had never opened the lock herself. The wind moved across the clearing. Ruth turned the key. The padlock opened. The door swung inward on hinges that complained once, a long, low groan of metal that had not moved in 5 decades, and then went quiet. Ruth stood in the opening and let her eyes find the dark. It was not as dark as she expected. The barn had a row of small windows set high under the eaves along the south wall, 4 of them, and though they were filmed with decades of grime, and one had a crack running corner to corner, Enough gray October light came through to make shapes. She could see the floor, wide-planked wood, and walls of the same board and batten as the exterior, and the ceiling far above held by hand-hewn beams the size of something you don't find anymore. The air that came out at her was cold and still and layered with a smell she couldn't immediately name. Dust and wood, and something underneath both of those, faintly sweet, faintly sharp. She stepped across the threshold. Pearl made a sound from the car behind her. Ruth turned, saw the carrier on the front seat through the windshield, and went back to get her. She was not going into this without Pearl. She lifted the carrier and carried it to the doorway and set it down just inside, and Pearl pressed her face to the mesh and went very still, reading everything. Ruth walked in slowly. Her footsteps on the wooden floor were soft, but the barn magnified them the way large, empty spaces do. So each step sounded measured and deliberate even when she wasn't trying for that. The south wall held the windows. The north wall held shelves, tall ones, floor to ceiling, built with the same solid intention as the barn itself. And the east and west walls held something she hadn't seen from outside because the angle of her approach hadn't revealed it. Tools. Not scattered, not hanging in the careless way of a general farm building. Organized. A long workbench ran the full length of the east wall, maybe 30 feet, its surface dark with age and use, and above it hung a system of wooden pegs and brackets that held hand tools in rows. Chisels arranged smallest to largest, mallets of different weights, handsaws with their teeth wrapped in cloth, wooden planes lined up with their saws facing outward, a set of carving gouges in a leather roll pinned open against the wall. Every tool hung in its assigned place. Every bracket was labeled with a small piece of wood on which someone had burned a name or a size into the surface with a hot tip. Ruth stood before the workbench and put her hand on the surface. The wood was smooth under her palm in the places where hands had rested and rough at the edges where it had never been touched. Her father's hands had rested here. Lewis Garrett had died in January of 1972. Ruth had been 16. He had gone to the hospital on a Wednesday with chest pain and had not come home, and the quickness of it, 3 days from the first complaint to the last breath, had been the governing fact of Ruth's life for a long time after. You did not expect things to end in 3 days. You did not build toward the possibility of 3 days. Her mother had sealed the barn that April, 6 weeks after the funeral, and they had moved to town by summer, and Ruth had never been back to this property since. She remembered the barn differently. As a child, she had not been allowed inside. Not because Lewis was secretive about his work, but because the tools were sharp and the machines were loud, and he had the particular protectiveness of a craftsman who understood that a workshop was not a playroom. What she remembered was the sound of it from outside, the movement of hand saws and the occasional mechanical whir of something electric, and the smell of sawdust that clung to her father's shirt at dinner. She had not been inside this building in her life until this moment. She moved deeper into the space. At the center of the barn floor, arranged with the careful spacing of someone who understood how to move around objects while working, stood a collection of furniture covered in canvas drop cloths. 8 pieces, maybe 10. Some low and broad, some tall, their shapes visible through the canvas the way shapes are visible through anything that covers without concealing. A chair here, a cabinet there, something long and flat that might have been a table or a door. The canvas was gray with dust and in places had gone stiff, but it was intact. Whatever was under it had been covered deliberately, not abandoned. Ruth went to the nearest covered piece and lifted a corner of the canvas. A chair, not a plain chair. A rocking chair with arms that curved in a single uninterrupted sweep from the back posts to the front, no joint visible. The wood bent in the way that only steam and patience and a particular kind of skill can bend wood without breaking it. The finish had darkened with age to something between amber and brown, but the surface was still smooth when she touched it, still reflecting light from the filthy windows in a way that meant the grain beneath was fine and even. She tipped the chair forward slightly and looked at the bottom of the rocker. Her father's initials were there, burned into the wood, L.G., and a date, 1971. He had finished this chair the year he died. Ruth stood holding the corner of the canvas and looked at the rocking chair her father had made in the last year of his life, and she breathed slowly, and she did not try to name what she was feeling because naming it would have required a word she didn't have. She moved to the next covered piece, a tall cabinet, 4 feet wide, with doors that sat flush in their frames with a precision that spoke of hours of fitting and adjusting. She opened one door. Inside, the shelves were dovetailed into the sides, each joint so tight she could not fit a fingernail into the seam. The wood inside the cabinet smelled of cedar. The next piece was a dining table, oval, its surface unmarked by use because it had never been used, and the grain of the top was matched left to right in a pattern that was not accidental. Two pieces of the same board mirror matched, so the figure repeated itself across the center line like a reflection. It was the kind of thing you noticed without knowing why, and then couldn't stop noticing. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She went through every covered piece. A blanket chest with carved panels on the front. A writing desk with a tambour top that still rolled on its original runners. A low settee with a woven seat that had gone dusty but had not rotted. A corner cabinet with glass panes set in hand-cut muntins, each pane original, wavy with age. A cradle, small and plain compared to the other pieces, with a motif of leaves carved along the headboard in a style she recognized as something her father had talked about once, something he'd learned from his own father in a county 2 states east. She counted 11 pieces in total, covered and preserved. She was still standing in the center of the barn, her coat on and her hands cold, and Pearl watching from the carrier in the doorway, when she heard tires on the gravel. She went to the barn door and looked out. A truck was coming slowly up the track, a dark green pickup, old but running. It stopped at the edge of the clearing and a woman got out, small and deliberate in her movements, wearing a heavy canvas coat and rubber boots that had seen serious use. She was in her late 70s at least, white-haired, with a face that had been outdoors in most seasons for most of her life. The woman stood beside the truck and looked at the Honda, and then at the open barn door, and then at Ruth standing in it. "I saw a car on the Briar Creek Road this morning," she said. Her voice was steady and carried without effort. "Figured I'd come by afternoon to see if someone was still here, or if you'd gotten turned around and left." "I'm still here," Ruth said. The woman walked across the clearing without hurrying. She had the gait of someone whose knees had opinions, but who had decided not to negotiate with them. "Vera Sutton," she said when she reached the barn door. She did not extend her hand, just said her name, and looked at Ruth with the frank attention of someone who was accustomed to assessing situations quickly. "I live about 3/4 of a mile east. My family's been on that property since 1938. "Ruth Holt," Ruth said. "My mother was Estelle Garrett." Vera's expression shifted. Not surprise exactly. Something slower than surprise, more like the recognition of something expected that had nonetheless taken a long time to arrive. "I knew your mother," Vera said. "I knew your father too. I was a young woman when Louis died." She looked past Ruth into the barn, at the canvas-covered shapes standing in the dim light. "You found the shop. I didn't know it was here." "No. Estelle wouldn't have told you. She couldn't talk about it." Vera was quiet for a moment, looking at the pieces. Louis was working on a commission the week he died. A collector in Asheville had commissioned a full dining set, 8 chairs, a table, a sideboard. He'd been working on it for 8 months. He finished the table and the sideboard before the end. She nodded toward the covered shapes. "Those are in there somewhere." Ruth said, "How much did the commission cost?" "In 1971 dollars, $6,000 for the full set." Vera looked at her steadily. Louis Garrett was not a local furniture maker. People came from 3 states to commission his work. The collector in Asheville had a gallery. He wanted to exhibit Louis's pieces alongside craft furniture from other Appalachian makers. "Your father was going to be in a museum show." Ruth sat down on the barn floor with no particular intention of doing so. She simply sat down, the way the body sometimes makes decisions the mind hasn't caught up to yet. Vera sat down beside her on the running board of nothing, just on the wooden floor with her knees up and her rubber boots flat, the way a woman sits who has spent time outdoors and is not bothered by floors. "Estelle sealed this barn because she couldn't look at his work without falling apart," Vera said. "I think she also felt guilty." The gallery in Asheville had been calling for months before Louis died, asking when the commission would be finished, and after the funeral they called again, and she couldn't speak to them. "She sealed the barn and moved you both to town, and she never came back here." Vera paused. "She told me about it once, years later. Said she'd always planned to sort it out eventually, and never did." "She left me the deed," Ruth said. "I know." She told me she was going to. Said there was nobody else it made sense to give it to. Ruth looked at her hands, at the dust on them from the barn floor, at the calluses that had come from years of housework and bookkeeping and gardening in the backyard of a house she no longer had access to. I need to stay here tonight, she said. Vera looked at the barn, at the Honda with the carrier still visible on the front seat, at Ruth sitting on the floor of a building with no heat and no water and no furniture except furniture that was covered in canvas and wasn't meant to be used. There's a camping stove in my truck, Vera said, and 2 sleeping bags from when my grandsons used to come in summers. I'll get them. She did not ask questions about why Ruth had arrived at her mother's sealed property with a cat and a winter coat and nothing else. She did not require an explanation. She went to the truck and came back with a camp stove and 2 sleeping bags and a paper bag with bread and a jar of peanut butter and 2 cans of soup. She set the camp stove up in the barn doorway where the ventilation would carry the propane fumes out, and she heated the soup in a pot she produced from the bag the way someone produces a pot who has done field cooking before and knows to bring everything. They ate sitting on the barn floor with the doors open and the last of the October daylight coming in at a low angle, and Pearl eating a handful of kibble from a small bag Ruth had remembered to pack, and the camp stove's blue flame visible in the gap between the door and the frame. Vera talked about Lewis while they ate. She had known him from the time she was a girl, had grown up on the adjoining property, and watched Lewis build his reputation piece by piece. He had started with simple things, chairs and small tables for local families, work that paid modestly and that he did with such care that word moved outward from one person to the next the way word does when someone is genuinely excellent at something. By his 40s, he was taking commissions from buyers in 3 states. The Asheville gallery owner, a man named Doyle, had discovered him through a chair he'd spotted in someone's home and had spent 6 months tracking down the maker. Lewis never thought of himself as an artist, Vera said. He thought of himself as a craftsman, which meant he took the work seriously in a way that artists sometimes don't, because a craftsman understands that the thing has to function as well as it has to look. Every piece in this barn was made to be used. Ruth looked at the covered shapes in the lamplight. Vera had brought a battery lantern, which she'd set in the center of the floor, and its light moved softly across the canvas and caught the edges of the visible workbench. What are they worth? Ruth asked. I don't know exactly. I'm not an appraiser. Vera considered it. I do know that Doyle's gallery is still open in Asheville. I know that there's been a strong market for Appalachian craft work for the past 20 years, documented maker pieces especially. And I know that your father's name appears in at least 2 books about the Southern craft movement, books written by people who did not know the work still existed. She looked at Ruth. What I can tell you is that I have never seen Doyle, or anyone who came after him, find anything by Lewis Garrett for sale anywhere. Because there was nothing for sale. Ruth let that sit. Pearl had finished eating and had come to press herself against Ruth's leg. Ruth put her hand on the cat and felt the warmth of her, the small solid weight of something living. Vera left as the full dark came on. Promising to return in the morning with breakfast and a kerosene heater she kept in her barn for emergencies. Ruth watched the truck's taillights move down the track and disappear at the bend, and then she was alone in the barn with Pearl and the lantern and 11 pieces of furniture her father had made in the years before she was allowed into this building. She spent the first night in a sleeping bag on the barn floor with the camp stove warming the air to something survivable and Pearl pressed against the curve of her knees. She lay on her back and looked up at the hand-hewn beams and thought about Lewis working in this building through the years of her childhood, and about the sound of his tools she'd heard from outside and never known the full meaning of, and about Estelle packing a key into a hat lining and writing a note on the back of a grocery list and storing it in a box she knew would only be found when everything else was gone. She woke before dawn to the sound of wind against the barn boards and Pearl walking a circuit of the sleeping bag's perimeter. The camp stove had gone out during the night and the cold had moved in from the corners, not dangerously cold, but cold enough to make her breath visible. She relit the stove with the lighter from her coat pocket and heated water for coffee from the jar of instant she'd found in the paper bag Vera left. She sat in the barn doorway with the mug in both hands and watched the October morning come in across the clearing, the light moving first through the treetops and then down the south wall of the barn and across the grass until it reached her feet. Over the days that followed, she learned the property. The well was on the north side of the old foundation, and it still produced water, cold and clean when she worked the handle. The pump needed priming the first time, and the water that came up was reddish with iron for several minutes before it ran clear, but it ran. She collected it in the camp pot and boiled it on the stove out of habit, though it tasted fine. Vera brought the kerosene heater on the second morning as promised, and Ruth positioned it in the corner of the barn away from the canvas-covered furniture, enough distance between the flame and her father's work that she could sleep without worrying. The heater took the cold back enough that the barn became tolerable, not warm but not punishing, the air around the heater almost soft. She began uncovering the furniture systematically. She pulled each canvas cloth off with care, shook out the dust outside, and folded it. Then she looked at what her father had made with the same slow attention she had once given to a ledger that didn't balance. Looking for the organizing principle, trying to understand the whole by reading each part. Every piece was finished. Not a single one showed a surface left rough or a joint left open. Lewis had not been someone who set things aside before they were done. Even the commission pieces, the table and the sideboard she found under a double layer of canvas near the back, showed the work of a man who understood that finished meant something specific, something you could measure. She found his notebooks on the third day. They were on the lower shelf of a cabinet built into the north wall, behind a row of hand-labeled glass jars containing finishing oils and waxes that had long since hardened. 5 composition notebooks, their covers stiff with age, held together with a rubber band that disintegrated when she touched it. She carried them to the workbench and opened the first one. Her father's handwriting was small and precise and ran right up to the margins. The notebooks held everything: commission records with client names and addresses and the agreed price and the delivery date and the wood species chosen and why. Sketches of pieces in progress, dimensioned in the careful way of someone who didn't need to measure twice because they measured once with total attention. Notes on finishing techniques, on the behavior of different wood species in different seasons, on the specific way cherry darkens over time versus walnut, and how to account for that when a client wanted 2 pieces to match after 20 years of use. And among the commission records, letters. Folded into the back of the third notebook, a stack of correspondence. She recognized Doyle's name from what Vera had told her. 3 letters from the Asheville Gallery, the first asking about Lewis's availability for a group show, the second confirming the commission terms, the third, dated November 1971, 2 months before Lewis died, confirming that a collector in New York had expressed interest in acquiring the full dining commission for a private collection after the show closed, at a price Doyle described as strong. Ruth read the number written in that letter twice. Then she sat down on the workbench stool and looked at the canvas-covered sideboard in the back of the barn. She was still sitting there when she found the door. She had not noticed it the first time she walked the barn's perimeter because the north wall was shelved from floor to ceiling, and the shelving was continuous, and the door was set behind a section of shelving that appeared identical to the sections on either side of it. But on the 4th morning, pulling a jar from the back of the lowest shelf to see what it contained, her fingers found the edge of something that was not shelf back. A vertical line, faint in the old wood, that ran from the shelf's surface to the floor. She pressed along it and found the gap, barely a 1/4 inch, that ran the full height of what she now understood was not a wall but a door. She stepped back and looked at the entire shelf section. It was built on the door the way some shelving is built, into the frame, carried on the door itself, so that moving the door meant moving the shelving. There was no handle visible. She ran her hands along the frame on the right side and found, at shoulder height, a small wooden button set flush with the surface, barely a bump under her fingers. She pressed it. Something released. The shelf section moved outward 1/2 inch, swinging on hinges she hadn't seen because they were set inside the frame and painted over with the same gray of the wall. The whole shelf unit, contents and PRO call, pivoted outward on a heavy central pin. Behind it was a door, low-framed and plain, with a simple iron latch. Ruth stood before it with the lantern in one hand and the cold air of the barn at her back, and Pearl sitting 3 feet behind her, tail still, watching. She lifted the latch and pushed the door open. The room was small, 10 feet by 12, maybe, with a ceiling low enough that Ruth had to step through the door at a slight duck. Her father had built it himself. She understood that immediately, because the walls inside were finished in a way the rest of the barn was not. Smooth boards fitted close and tight, and the floor was a different wood than the main barn floor, narrower boards, darker, laid in a herringbone pattern she had seen once in a photograph of a house in a magazine her mother had kept on the coffee table for years without ever explaining why she liked it. The lantern light moved across the room as she stepped in, and Pearl appeared at her ankles and pressed past her without hesitation, beginning her survey of the perimeter the way she surveyed every new space. On the left wall, a narrow workbench, shorter than the one in the main barn and lower, the height of a bench meant for seated work, for detail work, for the close and patient carving that required stillness. Small tools arranged on a rack above it, carving gouges and chip-carving knives in a pattern that mirrored the organization of the larger tools outside. A glass jar holding pencils, still upright. A wooden box containing what turned out, when Ruth opened it, to be the punches and stamps her father had used for the decorative details she'd seen on the blanket chest and the cradle. On the right wall, 8 chairs. They stood in a row against the wall, set on the floor with a strip of felt beneath each leg to protect the finish. 8 chairs, each one the same form, but each slightly different in its detail. Variations on a shape that was clean and spare and built on the logic of how a human back actually meets a chair back rather than how a chair maker imagines it should. She touched the nearest one. The finish was silky in the way that only hand-rubbed oil finishes are silky, a texture that does not feel like a coating, but like the wood itself has changed its nature and become something that welcomes your hand. The Asheville Commission. 8 chairs, finished and stored and never delivered, because Lewis had not survived to deliver them. She stood among them for a long time. At the back of the room, opposite the door, hung 3 things on the wall. A photograph, a drawing, and an envelope. The photograph was old, black and white, 6 inches by 8, in a plain wood frame Lewis had almost certainly made himself. It showed a man standing in a doorway she recognized now as the barn door she had walked through an hour ago, and the man's posture was relaxed, his hands in his pockets, his face turned slightly toward the camera with the expression of someone who had been asked to stop working and be photographed, and had complied without much enthusiasm. Her father, decades younger than she remembered him because she had only been 16 when he died, and her memory held him at the end rather than in his prime. He was younger in this photograph than she was now. The drawing beside it was charcoal on heavy paper, a sketch of the room she was standing in, dimensioned and annotated in her father's hand, the plan he had drawn before building it. In the corner of the drawing, in smaller writing, a note. Finished October 1969. He had built this room in 1969, 3 years before he died. The envelope was between them, tacked to the wall with a single brad nail, and her name was on the front. Not Ruth Holt. Not Ruth Garrett Holt. Just Ruthie, in her father's handwriting, the same hand as the notebooks. She took it from the wall. The seal had been gummed and pressed but not taped, and it opened cleanly. Inside, 2 sheets of paper folded together, covered in the small, precise handwriting of the notebooks. She brought the lantern close and read. Ruthie, if you're reading this, then Mama gave you the key like I asked her to, and you found the shop, and you found this room. I want you to know that I built this room in 1969 because I needed a place to think and to work on things I wasn't ready to show anyone yet. I want you to know something else, which is that I have watched you stand at the window of this barn your whole life, and I know what that watching meant. You have my eye. I don't know if you know that, but you do. The way you look at something to understand how it was made before you look at it for any other reason. That is not something everyone has, and it is not something that can be taught. It is something you came into the world with, and I have been meaning for years to bring you in here and show you what to do with it. I was diagnosed in October. I have not told your mother, and I am asking you, if she is still living when you read this, not to tell her I knew before I told her, because it would hurt her to know I carried it alone for a while, and I carried it alone because I needed the time to finish what I had promised Doyle. I wanted to deliver the commission. I wanted to leave the work done. I did not finish in time. I am sorry for that. What is in this? Barn is yours, Ruthie. The tools, the pieces, the notebooks. All of it. Your mother will keep the land and the building, and she will give it to you when the time is right, and I trust her to know when that is. Use the notebooks. The answers to most of what you'll want to know are in them. The rest you will figure out by doing, because that is the only way anyone learns this work. I am sorry I did not get to teach you myself. I thought I had more time. I think most people do. Dad Ruth stood in the small room her father had built in 1969 and read the letter twice. The second time she read it more slowly, taking each sentence the way you take something hot, carefully, aware that carelessness would cost her. She had been watching from the window her whole childhood. She had not known that he saw her. She did not fall to her knees. She did not cry in the way that dramatic moments sometimes demand. She sat on the floor of her father's private room, in the barn he had built and the property he had loved, with Pearl in her lap and the lantern making its soft light, and she held the letter in both hands and was very still for a very long time. Outside, the October wind moved through the clearing. The barn boards creaked once. Vera came the next morning at 8 with the kerosene heater refilled and a bag of groceries, and her late husband's old thermos filled with coffee that was still hot. Ruth met her at the barn door and told her about the room and the chairs and the letter, and Vera listened without interruption, which was one of the things Ruth was already learning to value about her. When Ruth finished, Vera said, "Doyle's son runs the gallery now. His name is Aaron. I have a number for him somewhere. He knows his father's history with Lewis. The family kept records." Ruth looked at the barn. "I need to think before I make any calls." "Of course you do," Vera said. "But while you're thinking, you should know that there is a man in Asheville who has spent 20 years looking for documented Lewis Garrett pieces. He has written about your father in 2 books. He would not be difficult to reach." Ruth thought about it for 3 days. She walked the property morning and afternoon, learning the 11 acres, finding the creek that ran along the eastern boundary, and the old apple orchard at the north end that had gone wild, but still held fruit, small and tart, and improbable in November. She worked through her father's notebooks, reading every page, absorbing the way his mind moved through a problem, the way he annotated his own mistakes and corrected them in the margin without embarrassment. On the 4th day, she called Aaron Doyle. The conversation lasted 40 minutes, and for the first 30 of them Aaron kept asking her to confirm what she was describing: the number of pieces, their condition, whether the commission chairs were finished, whether Lewis's notebooks and correspondence were intact, and each time she confirmed it the silence on his end lasted a little longer. "I need to come see them," he said. "Come when you can," Ruth said. He drove up from Asheville that Friday. He was in his 50s, with his father's height and the particular manner of a man who had grown up around serious craft objects and had never lost his reverence for them. He walked through the barn in silence, lifting canvas cloths and setting them aside, running his hands along surfaces without touching anything he hadn't examined first, opening drawers and closing them with the care of someone who understands that a piece of furniture is not only an object, but an argument about how things should be made. He spent an hour in the hidden room with the 8 commission chairs and did not speak at all. When he came out, he sat on the barn floor across from Ruth and Pearl and said, "My father talked about your father for the rest of his life. He always believed the work still existed somewhere. He never knew where. My mother sealed this barn the spring after he died and moved us to town," Ruth said. "She couldn't come back to it." Aaron nodded slowly. "I want to propose an exhibition. Not a sale, not yet, unless you want that, but a showing. Let people see what this work is. Let the record reflect that it exists." He paused. "After the exhibition, if you decide to sell any of it, I can help you find the right buyers. But I don't want to rush any of that. This work has waited 50 years. It can wait a little longer." It was the right thing to say. Ruth held the property together through November and into December with Vera's help and the money from the joint account that Gerald had missed. She paid the outstanding property taxes herself, a smaller sum than she expected, the land having been assessed at a value that reflected its abandonment rather than its potential. She arranged for a structural engineer to examine the barn, a woman named Carol who drove up from the county seat, and spent a morning going over every beam and joint and came back to tell Ruth the structure was sound, the foundation solid. The only significant work needed a re-roofing on the sagging ridge section and some repointing of the stone on the north wall. Vera's nephew did the roofing. He was 28 and worked quietly and well and charged Ruth less than the materials cost, which she argued with him about and lost. Dale, a neighbor 2 properties east who had heard from Vera that a woman was fixing up the old Garrett place, showed up one Saturday with a chainsaw and cleared the deadfall from the orchard in an afternoon. The property began to reveal what it had been under the years of neglect. The orchard, once cleared of its fallen branches, showed itself to be organized and intentional. 12 trees in 2 rows, old varieties she couldn't name, but that Vera identified as common to the region in the 1940s and 1950s. The fence along the east boundary was still standing, its posts set deep enough to have held. The well produced good water consistently. The creek ran clear and cold and had in it, Vera told her, trout that had been there since before either of them was born. Ruth moved her things out of the Honda and into the barn. She set up the sleeping area in the corner farthest from the tools, with the kerosene heater between her and the door, and Pearl arranged herself on the folded sleeping bag each night with the confidence of an animal that has decided a place is home and requires no further discussion. She did not sell the Honda. She drove it to town twice a week for supplies and mail, and once to meet with a lawyer in the county seat, a woman named Patricia Oakes who had been recommended by Aaron Doyle and who turned out to have the same quality Aaron had. She spoke to Ruth as someone who had full capacity for understanding her own situation and did not require protection from the details. The deed transfer was already on record from her mother's codicil. The property was Ruth's without dispute. Patricia helped her establish a small LLC through which she could manage any sale proceeds from the furniture, protecting the money from any complications arising from the divorce settlement. The hardware store settlement had been final and signed, but Patricia wanted the new assets properly separated from anything Gerald's lawyers might later argue was marital property. "He can't touch this," Patricia said. "It was your mother's, transferred before the marriage, held outside any joint accounts. This is yours in the clearest possible legal sense." Ruth drove back to the property on a Tuesday evening in December with the paperwork in the passenger seat and Pearl asleep in the carrier and the ridge country dark coming down through the trees, and she turned up the gravel track and saw the barn and the lantern light in the window she had propped open for ventilation, and she felt something she had not let herself feel in a long time, which was that she was going home. The exhibition opened in February at Doyle's Gallery in Asheville, in 2 connected rooms that Aaron had cleared specifically for the work. He had written the catalog notes himself, drawing on his father's correspondence and the letters Ruth had found in the notebooks, and the catalog documented not only each piece, but Lewis Garrett's full arc as a maker, from his early local commissions to the Asheville connection to the New York collector who had wanted the dining set for a private collection. Ruth attended the opening in a green wool dress she had bought at a second-hand shop in town for $14. And she stood in the corner of the first room and watched people stop in front of her father's rocking chair, the one she had uncovered first, and she watched them reach out and then pull their hands back because the sign said "Do not touch," and she watched them look at the chair the way her father had looked at things, which was to understand how it was made before anything else. A woman stopped beside her and said, "Do you know anything about the maker?" "A little," Ruth said. "My grandmother had a chair he made. A small side chair, nothing like these. She kept it her whole life and left it to my mother, and my mother left it to me. I drove 3 hours to see this show because I wanted to know who made the chair my grandmother loved." Ruth looked at the woman, who was perhaps 40, with the expression of someone who has carried a question for a long time and has finally arrived in a place where it might be answered. "He was careful with everything he made," Ruth said. "He believed that a thing made to be used should be made as well as you could make it, because the person who used it would live with it every day. He thought that mattered." The woman looked at the rocking chair. "It does," she said. Aaron sold 3 pieces from the exhibition, all to private buyers, at prices that Patricia Oakes later confirmed were well within the range of documented Appalachian craft work from that period and well above anything Ruth had let herself calculate. The remaining pieces, including all 8 commission chairs, Ruth kept. Not because they were unsaleable, but because her father had built them in the last months of his life to finish what he had promised, and they had waited 52 years in a sealed room, and she was not ready to let them go yet. The proceeds from the 3 sales were enough to properly weatherproof the barn, install a wood stove, run an electrical line from the county road, have the well tested and certified, and begin the foundation work for a small structure on the cleared section of the old farmhouse site. Nothing large, a 1-room building with a sleeping loft that would eventually be more comfortable than the barn floor. She was standing in the cleared orchard on a morning in March, pulling the last of the deadfall from between the apple trees, when she heard a car she didn't recognize on the gravel track. She came around the barn and found Gerald's black SUV parked at the edge of the clearing. He was standing beside it, his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the barn with its new roof and the electrical line on its new pole and the foundation stakes for the small building and the cleared orchard visible behind everything. He had lost weight since the last time she'd seen him, which had been across a table with lawyers between them, and the weight loss had not been kind to his face. He looked like a man who had been through several things and had not managed any of them well. Ruth walked across the clearing and stopped 10 feet from him. Gerald looked at her. He looked at the property behind her. He said, "I didn't." "No." Ruth waited. "Carol left," he said, 6 weeks after the papers were final. "I sold the house. The market was soft, and I didn't get what I expected." He looked at the barn again, at the new roof line, at the lantern visible through the window. "Nora told me where you were." "I know she did," Ruth said. "She called me last week." He was quiet for a moment. "You've built something here." "I found something here," Ruth said. "I'm building it from what I found." Gerald looked at her with the expression of a man who has arrived at a place expecting one conversation and is realizing another one is required. He had expected, she understood, either anger or welcome, either the satisfaction of a confrontation or the relief of forgiveness offered without cost. She offered him neither. "Gerald," she said, "you have not asked me how I am." He blinked. "How are you?" "I'm well," she said. "I'm better than I've been in a long time." She let that land where it would land. "You should go. I have work to do." He stood for another moment, and she could see him searching for the shape of something to say, the sentence that would rebalance things in his favor, and not finding it. He got back in the car. He drove down the gravel track without another word, and she watched his taillights disappear around the bend, and she felt nothing that needed to be classified. She went back to the orchard. Nora came 3 weeks later, on a Saturday, which was the day Ruth had started spending in the barn with her father's tools, following the notebook instructions for a simple exercise Lewis had described in the first pages of the first notebook, meant for beginners, a way to learn how it would behave before you asked it to behave in more complex ways. She was at the workbench with a piece of cherry and a hand plane when she heard the car. Nora had never seen the property. She stood at the edge of the clearing and turned slowly, taking in the barn and the new roof and the foundation work and the orchard and the creek visible at the far boundary. And her face went through several things before settling into something Ruth could only describe as reckoning. The kind that happens inside a person without being announced. She walked to the barn door. Ruth stepped out to meet her. Nora was wearing good clothes that were wrong for the country, a coat suited to a city street, and shoes that were already picking up mud from the track. She looked at her mother's hands, at the sawdust on them, at the plane in her right hand, and she said, "Mom," and stopped. "Come in," Ruth said. They sat on the workbench stools in the barn with the March light coming through the clean windows and Pearl on the rocking chair that Ruth had moved into the main space. And Nora looked at everything with the eyes of a woman who had told herself one story about what she was likely to find and was finding another. "Marcus left," Nora said. 2 weeks ago. His lawyer is telling him to declare bankruptcy." Ruth said nothing. "I don't know if I'm asking for anything," Nora said. "I don't know what I'm asking for." "Tell me what you want to say," Ruth said. "Not what you think I want to hear." Nora looked at her hands in her lap. "I told myself it was for your own good. I told myself you were struggling, that you needed more care than you could give yourself, that moving you somewhere managed was practical and kind. I believed some of it while I was saying it. Not all of it." Ruth waited. "I let Marcus run the numbers on Dad's house and tell me what made sense financially. And I let the numbers become a story about what was best for you. And I let the story become an action. And I changed the locks on a Tuesday morning while my mother was getting her blood drawn. And none of that was for your good." Nora looked up. "It was for mine. For ours. And I have known that every day since." Ruth looked at her daughter. 46 years old. The girl who used to bring her questions to Ruth's side of the bed at 7 in the morning, pressing herself under the covers for warmth before beginning whatever inquiry was on her mind. The teenager who had fought with Gerald about everything and with Ruth about nothing, because Ruth had been the one she trusted to receive her anger without damage. The woman who had changed the locks. "Your father and I made something," Ruth said. "We made you and your brother, and we made a life together that had real things in it. That is true. It's also true that I spent 45 years making myself smaller than I was so that the thing we made would hold together, and the thing fell apart anyway, and what was left of me was here." She looked around the barn, at her father's tools and her father's work and the small room behind the shelving where his letter to her still hung on the wall. "I'm not small here, Nora." Nora was crying, steadily, without drama. "I don't know yet if I can forgive you," Ruth said. I'm not in the habit of saying things I don't mean, but I am not going to close this door. She nodded at the barn entrance, at the light coming through it. You can come here. You can see who I'm becoming. We can find out what's possible between us after this, but we have to find out honestly, without either of us pretending the other is something she's not. Nora wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at the rocking chair, at Pearl arranged on its seat with her chin on her paws and her eyes half closed. She said he made that. In 1971, Ruth said. The year before he died. Nora got up and went to the chair and stood before it for a long time. She didn't touch it. She looked at the curve of the arms and the way the back joined the seat and the fine grain of the wood visible through the finish. And her face softened in the way that faces soften when they encounter something made with real care. I didn't know he could do this, she said. Neither did I, Ruth said. Not like this. April came. The creek ran high from snow melt, and the apple trees began to show blossoms, small and pale, on branches Ruth had thought were deadwood and had left standing on the chance she was wrong. She had been right to leave them. The orchard was alive, all 12 trees, and she learned their names from a book Vera brought. A limber twig, 2 Cox's orange pippins, a winesap, old varieties that had been growing in this part of the state since before either of their families had arrived. The small building on the old foundation was framed by late April, the work done by a crew Aaron Doyle had recommended, men who built in the vernacular style of the region and who had looked at the barn when they arrived and understood without being told that the new structure needed to speak the same language. They used reclaimed materials where they could. The window frames they salvaged from a building in town that was being demolished. The door they found at an architectural salvage yard in Asheville, old enough to have the wavy glass Ruth wanted. She moved in on a Saturday in May, when the light was long and the orchard was in full leaf. She carried her things from the barn in 3 trips, the sleeping bag and the camp stove and the lantern and her coat, and the paper bag with her essentials and Pearl in the carrier, and her mother's hatbox and her father's notebooks and the tin box that had held his letter. She set the rocking chair in front of the window that faced the barn. She made coffee on the wood stove, which was small and well fitted to the room's proportions, and she sat in her father's chair with the mug in her hands and looked at the barn across the clearing, at the new roof and the electrical line and the windows her father had set into frames he built himself before she was born. And she thought about the distance between the woman who had signed 7 documents in a hand she had made steady by force of will and the woman sitting in this chair on this morning, and she thought the distance was not as great as it might appear. The same woman, in both places, just able, finally, to take up her full space. She heard the sound from outside she had learned to recognize over the months. Pearl pushing through the cat flap Ruth had installed in the door, and then Pearl was on the windowsill beside the chair, pressing her face against the glass to read whatever the morning held beyond it. I know, Ruth said. It's a good morning. Pearl made a single sound of agreement and settled on the sill with her tail curled around her. The barn held its work. The tools hung in their places above the bench. Her father's notebooks sat stacked on the lower shelf where she could reach them. The hidden room was unlocked now, its door left open, the 8 commission chairs standing in their row, visited sometimes by Aaron when he drove up from Asheville, and once by a curator from a museum in Raleigh who had come specifically to see them and had sat in the room for a long time without saying much. The chairs would be loaned to the museum for an exhibition the following spring, returning afterward to the barn where they had waited. Vera came by on a Tuesday evening with sweet corn from her garden and stayed for dinner, and they ate on the small porch Ruth had added to the south side of the building with leftover lumber from the frame crew. The light went long and golden through the orchard, and the creek was audible from the porch if the wind was right, and Pearl sat between their chairs in the manner of an animal that has decided she is included in all conversations by default. Your father would have liked this, Vera said. She was looking at the barn, at the cleared land, at the orchard. I think he planned for it, Ruth said. I think he planned for more than any of us knew. Vera considered this. Estelle planned for it too, in her way. It took her 60 years, but she planned for it. Ruth looked at the hatbox sitting on the shelf inside the window, visible through the glass. The key was back inside it, in the lining she had repaired with a needle and thread from a kit she'd found in her mother's things. She had put it back because it belonged there, because some objects earn their place through what they carry and not through what they can still be used for. She had 45 years of a life that had been built around someone else's center. She had 7 signatures on a document that had ended that life in the only way it could end, which was at a table with lawyers, which was the way things end when the ending has been coming for a very long time. She had $4,800 and a cat and a Honda and a key in a hat lining and a note on the back of a grocery list. She had a barn full of work her father had made with his hands, work that had waited half a century for someone to find it with the right eyes. She had her name on a deed. She had her name on the wall of a gallery in Asheville, in the catalog notes Aaron had written. The collection was discovered by Garrett's daughter Ruth, who arrived at the property in October of last year and opened a barn that had been sealed since 1972. She had 11 acres in Harper County. She had an orchard in bloom and a creek with trout, and a neighbor who brought sweet corn and stayed for dinner. She had the notebooks and the tools and the letter. She had her father's eye, which he had seen in her when she was a girl watching from the window, and which she was only now beginning to understand how to use. She lifted her coffee cup and looked at the barn and the light falling across its old gray boards in the long May evening. And she thought about Estelle writing "Don't bring Gerald" on the back of a grocery list and sealing it in an envelope and putting it in a box and trusting the right moment to find the right person. They had taken everything she could carry. They had not known what she could not carry, because they had not known it existed, because it had been sealed in a barn for 52 years waiting for a Tuesday morning in October when she had nothing left to lose by opening it. She put the coffee cup down and reached for her father's newest notebook, the one she had started the week she moved into the small house, its pages clean and empty, a continuation of the record in a different hand, the way records continue when the person who started them could not finish. She wrote the date at the top of the first page. Then she wrote, Garrett's daughter. Learning to see. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.